magazine from the Presbyterian Support, People Helping People, and there'll be many members in this House who've had dealings with Presbyterian Support. I would doubt there'd be any hard-working member who hasn't called on Presbyterian Support at some time. And there's a very good editorial in it that I recommend that the Minister read, written by Vaughan Milner, Chief Executive, who said he's had 36 years' involvement in social services, and he said, "What I have learned is that living without adequate income and being blamed in the process is debilitating, demoralising and degrading, particularly when combined with some of the many challenges that life throws us, like poor mental or physical health, or relationship problems, grief or trauma. I have seen the overwhelming majority of parents who subsist on the benefit are capable budgeters, caring parents. They're contributing to the community through doing their best to raise their children to be functional adults. They and their children do not deserve to be pushed to the margins of the community." But, Minister, that is exactly what this bill is doing to those beneficiaries. And I want to just go through three main submissions that we heard at the Select Committee, because I think they're pertinent to this debate. And one of them was from Presbyterian Support. They had real concerns about the signals that this bill is sending to beneficiaries. They said that saying sole parents having to go out to work is more important than caring for children. Now, I think that is quite a powerful message from them. They're saying, where is the concern for the children alongside the need to go out to work? Is caring for children a job or not? Is it a worthwhile job or not? They said there's a conflict in what's being said in other policies about the importance of children. They went on to say that children will be disadvantaged by this bill. The next submission I would like to mention was from the New Zealand Council of Christian Social Services. These people who work in these organisations, many of them have dedicated a lot of their lives to working with the most disadvantaged in our community. And when we have a government that says we listen to the community, I want to know why they're not listening to these voices. Aren't they important? Don't you believe them? Of all their years of experience of working with people who are at the bottom of the heap, doesn't that count for anything? Well, the New Zealand Council of Christian Social Services said what the government should do is to focus on what works, not on what does not work, because no research has been provided to show that this approach is going to do what the Minister said. And I have to say that they weren't on their own. As members know, when a bill is provided to this House, a regulatory impact statement is also provided. And what did that regulatory impact statement say? It said there's no research currently available which accurately quantifies the size of behavioural response from these changes in policies. In other words, you don't know whether it's going to change a single thing. That's from the impact statement that was tabled in this House. So this is very much lick your finger, hold it up in the wind, see which way the wind's blowing. Oh, the wind's blowing against beneficiaries. Let's bring in a bill that gives a little bit more of a bashing of them. The New Zealand Council of Christian Social Services went on to say they don't see the appropriate aspects in this bill. They cannot see any appropriate aspects in this bill, particularly for children. And they urged us not to proceed with the bill. They said there's a wealth of evidence that it won't result in the outcomes wanted. A wealth of evidence. And they provided us with research from 1998, research on the widow's benefit. The next one I'd like to mention to the Minister is the submission from the Salvation Army. Who in this House has not got admiration for the work of the Salvation Army? They work with people, whether they are involved in drug addiction, right through to people who are homeless. And if there is a group in New Zealand society that most of us have had contact with as members of Parliament, it's the Salvation Army. They said this bill will mean the care of children will suffer when the pressure comes on sole parents, Mr Chairman, when the pressure comes on.
The Honourable Annette King.
When the pressure comes on sole parents to go out to work. If the minister, they said, was to use the flexibility that already exists in policy, then they would not need this bill. Have the members opposite heard that? If the government used the flexibility that exists in the current policy, they would not need to have this piece of legislation. They went on, the Salvation Army, to say that sanctions were not appropriate because what they were doing were making moral judgments, and particularly moral judgments about widows versus sole parents. Widows equal good, sole parents equal bad. You see, the sanctions apply to sole parents, but no sanctions for widows. Most of them are women. And so one group of women are good and one group of women are bad. They went on to say that populism is not an appropriate basis for making policy, because it is populism that has led this policy to be brought in legislation. They also said, what do you need? You need better education. Better education to help people get off those benefits in time when they've got the education and the training, they can move into a job and take primary responsibility for their families. They said that early childhood education will not be available for many of these parents who are being forced back to work. And the last one I want to mention, Mr Chairman, was from the Child Advocacy Group. They said the benefit of staying at home with children, by parents staying at home with children, should not be undermined. Should not be undermined. And this is absolutely at the centre of what we ought to be advocating for in New Zealand. The importance of and saying that caring for children is one of the most, if not the most fundamental task we want parents to undertake. It should not be an unrelenting focus on work, an unrelenting focus on being good parents and bringing up their children with the assistance that can be provided. That is what it ought to be about. It's the children who are being marginalised by this policy. Yes, Mr Woodhouse, you can get agitated, but you're voting for this bill, and that member opposite is going to be responsible for marginalising a whole group of children in New Zealand because they're not as good as his children. They're not as good as other members' children because they belong to beneficiaries. This Child Advocacy Group went on to say you need research and analysis before you start because children will be hit the hardest. That is what's said by the Child Advocacy Group. They do a lot of work with children, Mr Woodhouse. That is what they said to the Select Committee. You need research and analysis before you start because if you will hit the children the hardest. And that is who will be hit the hardest by this bill. They went on to say that in the United States, 10 years ago in the United States, they brought in this approach to welfare. They said there were 8 million children between the age of 5 and 14 when they brought in a sanction regime like this in the United States. There were 8 million children between the age of 5 and 14 who had inadequate supervision because their parents had to go out to work, because the single parents were often late. They had night shifts that wasn't suitable. The unrelentless focus on work will impact on the children in New Zealand. This has come from, the submissions I have read out are just some that we saw at the Select Committee, some that we heard. They were much longer in length. There were many, many more of them. There were something like 3 submissions in favour of this bill. And even Lindsay Mitchell, who comes from the Axe Party, or used to, who is said to be a social welfare commentator of the far right, didn't agree with this bill. Didn't agree with this bill. Well, she didn't agree with it because it didn't go far enough. But everybody else didn't agree with it because it does not do what the government sets out to do. It is a piece of political puffery. It is a piece of populism. It does not provide for the most vulnerable in our society, for children, and the children of beneficiaries are going to be the losers. You can attack their parents. You can say their parents are losers and shirkers and they don't want to work, they're lazy and they ought to get a job. And having said that, then stop and think, who are you going to affect?